Hello, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're located. I suppose you can hear me now. So we are here based in Grenoble, while at the same time the COP28 is just starting. One of our speakers, by the way, is queuing outside of the event place over there. Hopefully will join us in a couple of minutes. So welcome to all of you. You are probably used, as everyone knows, to participating to webinars. So people are connecting right now. You are muted because there is quite a bunch of people attending. You can participate by sending us messages in the chat box, in the question and answers. So we'll gather the questions either throughout the presentation when it's really technical, or we can answer quickly, or at the end of the webinar. So welcome again. The objective of this webinar is to leverage the COP28, and one of the main issues or topics to be discussed at the COP28 is what is called the Global Stocktake, which is not a very fancy name or to describe what's there. The idea of the Global Stocktake, it's part of the Paris Agreement in 2015, and it aims at taking some distance with what has been happening or what is in line or not with the Paris Agreement. By the way, we can guess already what will come out of this process, because there is no very detailed analysis that the COP will be presenting. There is no analysis per country. There is no bad or good guys or bad or good sector, etc. And there is no comparison with the so-called necessary trajectory, because through the Paris Agreement, there was no, by definition or by the decision of the process, there was no trajectory to be followed or distribution of burden by country or by sector. So what we will do there, what we have decided to do already a couple of months ago, is our own analysis, independent as we are, and we have been diving into detailed data per country, per sector, in order to look at what has really happened. So for this, we use two different things. One is the famous Kaya identity, in order to be able to analyze to break down the evolution of the emission through the different factors. Usually you would have countries typically saying, oh, last year our emissions dropped. By the way, it was mostly thanks or due to the COVID. And the next year the emissions go up because of the activity. So this identity and the analysis we present enables to really split the different causes in terms of activity, population, economy, development, and in terms of energy intensity, energy consumption per GDP, and also what we call the carbon factor, so the carbon intensity of the energy production. So that's the first point we will refer to. And the second one is that we will also comment or compare the trends and assess the future with our own scenarios that we've been doing for years and every year. So what we call the NR future scenarios. And we will refer to two scenarios. One is the NR blue scenario. It's a scenario that is based on the country's indices, which, by the way, are changing over time, and which is a scenario that is an improvement compared to today to the real trend, but it's obviously not a scenario leading to 2 degrees or under well below 2 degrees. And we have our own NR green scenario, which is one scenario that enables to target well under 2 degree evolution of temperature by the end of the century. And so what we've been doing, which is quite interesting, we've been looking at what we were writing in our 2016 NR future scenarios. We also looked at the IEA scenario at that time and so on. And it's quite interesting to do this, because looking year after year what is happening is not really exciting. It's not moving quickly. But after 7 years, it's quite significant, either, by the way, to assess that there is no real move, or also you will see that we can outline a number of trends that are positive and interesting. So this, we should have put it away. This is a presentation of Enerdata. Why we are able to do this, by the way, we have been doing energy and climate scenarios assessment for 30 years now. So, but I will shift this and we can continue. The speakers we are today here around me, so you will see the different faces afterwards. We have gathered so a couple of our analysts with Héléna and Quentin, Patrick Criqui that has already been participating to many of our webinars with Emeritus Research Director, if I'm correct, at the CNRS, and Gerd Leopold, Program Director from Climate Transparency, who is, by the way, queuing at the COP right now. Hopefully will join us in 1 or 2 minutes. So Patrick, Quentin, and Héléna will be presenting the different topics we have assessed, while we will ask Gerd to give us a kind of feedback or key learnings that he takes out of these messages or this analysis. So what we will present you is an analysis of 10 different topics. So it's not exhaustive. We are not covering all the countries. We are not covering completely all the different sectors. Typically, we chose to cover the residential and not residential plus commercial buildings, as usually we would do. But so we are focusing on sectors. We have a focus on the energy mix, obviously, but also on electricity and electrification trends. And we have 3 focus on regions, developed countries, China, specifically in Africa. And we will close this overview of insight by energy consumption, which becomes really to be a key challenge. I put with another color the introductory analysis on geopolitics, because obviously among what has happened since 2015, there has been a big change in the overall environment and political international environment. That's it for the introduction. I think we can now dive into the presentation. So I'll give the floor to the different speakers. Will show the different slides about the different topics, and then we'll have a Q&A session. Patrick, please.
Yes, thank you, Pascal. So what we have observed since the Paris Agreement is that there has been a drastically changing state of the world. What was expected in 2015? It was expected the pursuit of globalization with multilateral agreements as a key to international relations. What was expected also is the development of long-term, low-emission development strategies on top of the nationally determined contributions, which are the base for the Paris Agreement. And then there was, since 2009, this idea of organizing a flow of finance from the north to the south of about $100 billion per year to be reached in 2020. Where are we now? There has been indeed the submission of 68 long-term low-emission development strategies that represent 75 parties to the negotiation and 76% of 2019 emissions. After the 1.5 IPCC special report, it can be noted that more than 50% of these long-term strategies include net zero targets, and the net zero target has become the focal point of many climate policies. The question of the compensation for loss and damages is a divide in the North-South negotiations. This issue comes on top of the finance flow from the North to the South, and it will be at the heart of the negotiation in the next in the COP, in the ongoing COP. Then it has to be noted, of course, that international relations are in a turmoil due to the many conflicts that exist today. And globalization is replaced by some kind of fragmentation of the economic and geopolitical space. And this impacts indeed negatively the spread of low carbon technologies. What are the challenges and opportunities? Well, first of all, one can note that the geopolitics of oil and gas is not replaced, but it is combined today with the geopolitics of critical raw materials in the transition. And the key two issues are first, the ambition gap, the fact that national roadmaps need to be redefined in order to include more stringent short and medium-term goals. And there is also the implementation gap, which indicates that despite progress in carbon pricing, the levels for the transition are still lacking in many cases.
So I'll take it from here to start looking at more specifically at CO2 emissions, but first with a very macro perspective, just look at emissions in general before we deep dive into different sectoral and regional aspects. So first, following the same method, like look at what was expected in 2015. So what was clear is that there was going to be a continuous development. And by development, I mean not just economic, but also, increasing population and also increasing living standards. And it's going to drive energy consumption. And at the time, the idea was that there was going to be energy efficiency savings that would at least partly compensate for that increase. And just energy efficiency at the time was mostly discussed. Renewables, but also fossil fuel switching are going to help decarbonize the energy supply. And emissions would be expected to plateau, so to peak around 2025 and then start decreasing. What you see on the right chart is basically Pascal introduced earlier, the Kaya identity. It's a Kaya analysis of the main drivers of evolution of emissions between 2015 and 2022, as it should have been, right? So a huge impact of GDP growth, because that was the projections at the time, but they would be compensated by efforts, at least efforts in line with the objectives of the Paris Agreement, both in terms of energy intensity, so lowering the energy demand on the GDP, and a decrease in the carbon factor as well, to reach basically the same levels of emission that we had in 2015. Now, I mean, the title spoils it a little bit, but what actually happened is that emissions continue to grow, despite the fact that GDP growth was much lower than expected at the time. So if you see now the chart at the bottom right, the impact of the economic growth is much lower, and yet we weren't able to implement the necessary efforts in terms of energy intensity and carbon factor reduction to actually curb the emissions. Now, if we look at challenges and opportunities from a more global macro perspective, there, as Patrick mentioned, there's a lot of long-term objectives that have been announced, put in place, but very little concrete action plans that have been rolled out. And what seems to be very crucial at this point is that on top of these action plans, we have actual real short-term milestones for 2030, for example. So you start seeing that, for example, for the European Union, but it's still lacking in a lot of these long-term plans. What we're not seeing enough is actual policies to reduce energy consumption, not just technological energy efficiency and technical progress, just policies that are targeting a decrease in energy consumption. And another thing that's, I mean, is this really going to have an impact? It's not clear, but the fact that the effects of climate change are now pretty tangible in a lot of places, we can hope that it's going to drive a sort of pressure to get results in terms of I mean, not just adaptation, but also mitigation. But now we went from climate change denial to more of a climate change fatalism in many cases. So it's not clear exactly what role it's going to play, but hopefully it will be a positive one.
So now we're diving into the analysis of some consumption energy sectors, starting with the residential sector. And in this particular sector, there's been really an increasing energy demand since 2015, driven by a plurality of factors. And yet, in developed countries, the large-scale rollout of deep renovation has not begun yet, whereas Residential is one of the sectors which still consumes most energy at global level. So what was expected in 2015? Well, in emerging countries, population and economic growth would drive the expansion of new buildings with the construction of new buildings stock. And in developed countries, renovation, whether it be in its scale and in its pace, would also increase, together with fuel switching, which would improve. Where are we now? Since 2015, consumption patterns canceled out part of the energy efficient gains in the residential sector, which contributed to a rise of final energy demand by 12% at global level. So even if in the building sector, we had a small improvement in the isolation of buildings and thus efficiency gains, at the same time, behavioral changes such as the increase in the average individual flow per person and the fact that people in developed countries tend to live in bigger spaces actually cancel out these efficiency gains. Regarding the energy mix, we still need to shift from an energy mix which is based on fossil fuels to a mix which gives more space to electricity. And electricity should actually ramp up from 23% to 50% in 2050 if we want to stay aligned with a 2-degree scenario trajectory. Regarding CO2 emissions, they are still on the increase since 2015, with major disparities between different regions in the world. And this is also true for final energy consumption. As we can see on the chart below, there are great disparities between regions, with the US standing as the first region for final energy consumption per capita in residential sector, followed by the EU, whereas Africa and India are quite below the other regions. If we look at the drivers of this final energy demand in the residential sector, in developed countries, heating consumption has been on the rise and is still predominant, as well as in China, where heating represents 70% of the residential energy demand, whereas cooking dominates energy consumption in India and in Africa. So what are the challenges and opportunities in the residential sector? Well, in developed countries, a major innovation wave should be combined together with behavioral levers and the electrification of end use with the deployment of heat pumps where it's possible. And in emerging regions, and especially in Africa, we need to increase support for the decarbonization of cooking, and whether it be in the form of financial support together with capacity building for this continent.
Now let's look at the transport sector. Still, again, looking at what was expected in 2015. I mean, obviously, we expected that traffic, both in terms of passengers and goods, would be growing strongly because of economic and demographic growth, obviously, but also because of globalization that would be continuing. And therefore, the exchanges of goods would drive traffic up. Electricity was already seen as an important driver of decarbonization, but mostly limited to passenger road and rail transport. What actually happened? So final energy consumption went up. So passenger traffic has not yet fully recovered from COVID. So it's relatively stable if you compare to 2015, but freight transport continued to increase quite substantially. Even if we had efficiency gains, they were mostly offset by behavioral effects that have the opposite effect in terms of energy consumption. So the energy intensity was relatively stable. By behavioral effects, I mean things like the increase in the size of vehicles and the weight of vehicles, the occupancy rate that has been decreasing, as well as modal shift. So modal shift is something that we consider as a tool to decrease traffic in general, but what we're seeing historically is that it's the other way around, and people are mostly going towards cars from other more virtuous ways of transportation. Carbon factor barely evolved, only down by 1% since 2015. So not much has happened since 2015. Not much being perhaps hiding the fact that there are some positive dynamics, especially for EVs. So EVs have now reached 14% of car sales in 2022, but it's barely making a dent basically in oil consumption, which is stable at around 93% of the total transport sector, meaning that EVs only is a bit of a niche right now. It's only for passenger vehicles, and that's not representing much in terms of total transport. Challenges and opportunities. I think one key issue that we have right now is that there's no apparent real signs of decline in traffic, except in the case of during the period where COVID affected traffic substantially. Electrification is on the path to play an important role. So again, there are positive dynamics, but what we're seeing also in terms of technologies and in terms of the outlook is that opposite to what we believed in 2015, electrification and electricity and electric vehicles can play a role in other sectors, such as freight road transport, for example. And that's not something that we foresee at the time. But yet, difficult to imagine what would be the technologies to decarbonize certain areas of transport, such as aviation and international shipping. Now let's look at the industry sector. Still the same logic. In 2015, what did we expect? Well, actually, it was quite conservative. If you look at the main scenarios at the time, there was going to be an increase in consumption as per these scenarios, and a moderate decrease in emissions. So some, especially through fuel switching towards gas, for example, from coal towards natural gas, some decarbonization, but all in all, not a sector that is where profound transformations were expected. What's interesting to see, and you see that in the distribution of, I mean, it's from the point of view of fuel combustion, the top right chart, but the industrial production, especially since 2000, has been shifting quite drastically towards emerging economies, which means that basically the burden to decarbonize that sector lies on these economies. Except, if we consider large reshoring strategies, but even then, that's where the activity will lie in the future. So emerging economies are going to play a huge role in decarbonizing that sector. What actually happened? So industry output has grown by around 26%. And the main energy intensive sectors such as steel, cement, chemical sectors have grown by also around 30%. So we really have this increase in activity that basically drives emissions. But outside of that, the progress in terms of energy intensity and decarbonization are quite relatively encouraging, let's say. So energy consumption increased by 8% compared to the 26% in terms of output. So there are some substantial progress in energy efficiency. Interestingly enough, in China, it was quite important. And actually, China, in terms of energy intensity and in terms of carbon factor, is converging towards developed economies in that regard. Decarbonization trends, again, are quite encouraging as well. And we see a gradual, not a huge shift, but a gradual phase down of coal. And it's currently replaced by a mix of cleaner or relatively cleaner technologies, so gas, for example, but also electricity in the industry sector. Challenges and opportunities. So we need to ramp up decarbonization. So even though, again, it was relatively positive, but we can do much more. And I think that the chart on the bottom right shows that we are not far from the path that we need to follow in terms of carbon intensity, but we could do more, we should do more in that regard. And there are some, again, similar to transport, some improved perspectives going forward. So the outlooks now are predicting or projecting that the role of electricity will be higher than initially expected, especially in low to medium, for example, temperature in the industry. Now there are a lot of electricity-based solutions that would offer decarbonization on the one hand, but also energy efficiency as well. There's an important need, and this is actually across sectoral points. There's an important need to reducing goods and material consumption, to promote circularity, optimize life cycle of products, etc. So across sectors, basically less buildings, less cars would mean a lower demand for steel, cement, aluminum, and that sort of thing. So this will obviously impact the industrial sector.
Wait a second. Before going to electrification, just come back.
Let's just try to.
Yeah, so take a breath. I understand we have a technical issue in that people would see only Quentin, which is probably a good picture.
Yeah,
but
I agree.
While we have all the speakers picture or video at the same time. So how can we make sure?
We try to cut my video, but I don't know if
No, it's not through cutting you.
Yeah, it's because the sound is related to my
using,
computer.
yeah. But people see only use. Okay, so anyway, we have covered right now the different sectors, or different sectors at least, with industry, transport, residential. Then the next stage is that we dive into the energy sector, the both electrification to have a focus on it, and then the energy mix. So at the same time, you can put some questions if you want on the Q&A box that is accessible there. At this stage, there is none, so take 1 minute if you want, and don't hesitate to put some comments or questions. Happy to answer those.
Let's go ahead.
Let's go, yeah.
So yeah, I'm sorry that you can only see my face. Let's try to plow ahead. So as Pascal mentioned, we've covered basically the demand, the end use perspective. Now we're going to look at the supply side of it and also some regional dynamics. So let's start with electrification. Again, what was expected initially? Well, electricity as a tool to decarbonize and to reach long-term mitigation objectives is basically a combination of two things, and I was already obviously identified in 2015. Both, increasing the share of electricity in final demand, but at the same time, obviously decarbonize power generation. Otherwise, the impact on CO2 emissions is quite low. At the time, there were already ambitious targets for renewables to basically gradually take over power generation and to decarbonize power generation. But the long term of electricity, so the projected shares of electricity was perceived as somewhat limited. I think in the World Energy Outlook, the global share of electricity in final demand was around 24-25% by 2040, because that was the timeline by then. In our own scenarios, it was a little bit higher, I think 30% in 2040, 36% in 2050. Now it's much more ambitious. And actually, if you look at the chart on the bottom, on the top right, sorry, you see the projected shares of electricity, as well as the historical share and what happens if we continue with the similar trend. And we go as high as 50% of final demand globally. But what has happened historically? Well, the share of electricity has barely increased, so very slowly, 20% versus 18% in 2015. But again, that was what was projected at the time, that it would not, increase that much at least in the short term. Also, something to consider is that if you look at electricity from the point of view of final demand, you don't have the whole picture of the deployment of electricity-based solutions, because they're often associated with energy savings compared to traditional options. The pace at which the power generation is decarbonized is definitely not fast enough currently, and we need to really ramp up that, which means that electrification, even if we had an increase in the share of electricity in certain sectors in certain countries, the impact on global CO2 emissions was actually quite negligible because the carbon content of electricity is still very high. There are some positive dynamics. I mentioned this in the sectoral slides in terms of both the pace at which electric vehicles are deployed, for example, and at which renewables also, and we'll talk about that in the next slide, are deployed. But we need a ramp up of that trend, obviously. And also we need that to be expanded to other sectors and to have a more global impact on energy systems. As said, once rolled out, a lot of electricity-based solutions will offer substantial energy efficiency gains. So there's this double benefits of switching to electricity solution. And there have been some technological breakthrough, renewables being increasingly more competitive, which have extended basically the range, or at least the perception. This is something I mentioned earlier, of electricity in long-term scenarios. It's now much higher than what we expected in 2015, which is a positive thing.
As far as the energy mix, one has to note important differences between the total primary energy supply and the energy supply or the energy fuel mix for the electricity sector. What was expected in 2015? Well, first of all, it was expected that the falling cost of renewables could bring a rapid and strong development of renewable in power generation. Also expected was a coal phase out, and it was considered as a major priority. It is still. Natural gas was seen as a transitory solution in the energy transition. Today, fossil fuel still represents, unfortunately, 82% of the primary energy consumption. So this is a stable solution, almost stable solution. And oil is still number one in the energy mix, followed by coal, representing respectively 30% and 28%. Renewables at the total primary energy level represent 13% of total, and they are only 1.3 percentage point higher than in 2015. Bioenergy and hydropower remain the main renewable energies, and what can be observed is the fact that renewables are adding up to the fossils rather than substituting them. However, renewable in the electricity sector are on track with a 2-degree trajectory, with a progress of 4% per year between 2015 and today. What are the challenges and opportunities? The main challenge is, of course, the phase out of fossil fuels on the whole and in the electricity sector. This may imply cutting down subsidies and implementing environmental accounting regulations, strong regulations in order to ban progressively or rapidly the fossil fuels. However, renewables are now considered to have reached their cost competitiveness, and this is translated in increasing investment in renewable energy sources. If we consider now the problem from a country perspective, a first glance at what happened in the developed countries, one can say that in these countries, the transition has started, but it has to be strongly accelerated. There has been some progress observed, but these progress are not sufficient to fill in both the ambition and the implementation gap. In 2015, it was expected a limited but regular economic growth, 3% per year, as we have already said, in a stable and globalized world. There was a strong confidence in new technologies for reducing GHG emissions through mostly energy efficiency and decarbonization. There was also this commitment to finance developing country roadmaps, these $100 billion per year we already mentioned. What appeared already in 2015 was the fact that NDCs were not online with the below 2 degrees objective. Today, CO2 emissions remain much higher than world average. CO2 emissions in developed countries remain per capita remain much higher than the world average, and they are above the 2 degrees trajectory, despite something like a 10% decrease since 2015. Investment in renewable energy sources has strongly accelerated, and these sources are now perceived as cost-effective. Coal has decreased in several key countries, such as US, UK, Germany, but not oil nor gas. The reduction in energy consumption is not addressed sufficiently aggressively, and most countries may have raised their targets, but they don't really address the implementation gap. And finally, the challenges and opportunities. The first challenge is to identify levels for the implementation of the short-term action plans. Indeed, there is a growing social pressure in developed countries for action in developed countries, but one can note recently some resistance in some countries, which might be a kind of a problem. What also appears very clearly now is the fact that local and corporate initiatives have a key role to play in the grid transition to low carbon development.
Now let's look at China as a proxy for emerging countries, but also as a very specific case, actually. So what was expected in 2015 again? So there was going to be obviously strong economic and demographic as well development, along with a raise of living standards in a country like China, which will obviously drive energy demand and CO2 emission. But the expectations already at the time was that emissions would be peaking somewhere around 2025, 2030 at the latest, depending on the scenarios. So what did happen? So energy demand and CO2 emissions rose quite substantially by respectively 26% for energy demand and 15% for emissions. And consumption was really driven by activity. So GDP was up 47% since 2015, which is slightly lower than what was projected at the time. Namely, I mean, because of COVID and because of the last year in 2022 was a specific year in China in that regard. But overall, activity of all forms and all sectors have substantially increased. For example, in the industry, the increase in output was around 45%. Passenger traffic has actually decreased slightly since COVID, but between 2015 and 2019, it was around plus 30%. Plus 38%, I think, for freight transport as well, and energy consumption by capita in the residential as a proxy for increase in living standards and maybe higher access to energy consumption has increased by 25% over that period. So a huge activity drive, which has increased energy demand and CO2 emissions. In spite of that, we've seen some progress both in energy intensity and the carbon factor. The general idea is that it decreases at a faster pace than developed economies, but because it was coming from obviously a higher point, energy intensity is still much higher than the OECD average. But you'd have to take into account, for example, the higher share of industry in China compared to OECD average to have a full picture. But that gives an idea of where they are at the moment. Carbon factor was down by 9%. That's also a lot faster than what we've seen in developed economies. The share of coal has slightly went down also, minus 5 percentage points since 2015. There is, especially in certain sectors in industry in particular, there is a convergence actually in terms of carbon factor towards the same levels of developed economies. So that's quite interesting. There are strong dynamics on both renewables and EV deployment. So the chart at the bottom right shows that basically China is responsible for more investment in new renewable capacities in the power sector than the OECD. And if you look at the percentage of these capacities that are renewable based compared to fossil fuels and or nuclear, we are at around 70% of these capacities that are renewables in China, against a little bit more, slightly lower than 80% for OECD countries. So it's quite comparable in that regard. And in terms of volume, it's obviously quite impressive. Challenges and opportunities. So one thing I already said about industries, that the burden of decarbonization lies heavily on not just China, but emerging economies in general. That's not to say that if you look at relative efforts, we expect obviously developed economies to do more, but because of the sheer weight of China and other countries in the global energy balance by 2050, I mean, this is where the abatement will basically reside. And according to our inner future scenarios, the total accumulated abatement is basically for which China is responsible, is around 34% of the global abatement. There is a net zero objective for China by 2060, but with basically a CO2 emissions peak by 2030, which is a bit of a non-statement. It's basically what most current policy scenarios would lead to, even sooner than that. So in terms of implementation, there has been lacking basically transparency and concrete action plans, but the specificity of China makes it so that, I mean, there are definitely the tools to get there, and the possibility to make into laws and to actually implement strong and stringent policies to get there. So hopefully this is what we'll be seeing in the next few years. And by the magic of this turning my computer, here's Héléna.
Now let's look at the case of Africa. So it's still a region which has a very, very low and limited contribution to global CO2 emissions, historically and still now as well. And yet some social, economic, and demographic challenge remains in this continent. So what did we expect in 2015 in Africa? We would expect that demographic growth, together with an improvement of living conditions, would drive CO2 emissions increase. And at the same time, fairer energy access for the population would improve as well. So where are we now? Africa still has a limited carbon impact at global scale. It only accounts for 1% of global cumulated CO2 emissions. But yet, there are some important demographic as well as social challenges remaining on this continent. So population growth, as you can see on the chart on the top right, population growth is the first driver of the emission increase since 2015. Population growth added 0.2 gigaton of CO2 since 2015. Regarding the energy mix in Africa since 2015, there was a rapid increase in the share of electricity as it reached 10% of the final energy mix in Africa in 2022. However, there is still a need to increase this electrification rate as we would need to reach 76% by 2040 if you want to stay aligned with a 2-degree scenario target. The residential sector is quite a challenge for Africa, as Africa is still highly dependent on traditional biomass. It accounts for 84% of final energy demand in residential sector, and this high rate of biomass is still expected to increase in the upcoming years. So we need to decarbonize this sector. So what are the challenges and opportunities? Africa is one of the most, if not the most vulnerable continent to the impacts of climate change, and yet it has really low adaptation capacities, thus highlighting the needs for enhanced support at regional but also at international level. And this goes with the second point on the fact that there is a need to improve energy access for the whole population, and a need to increase electrification by developing renewable energy. And on this question, there is increased international cooperation. So a few years ago at COP26, there's been the launch of the first Just Energy Transition Partnerships, JETP. So there was a financial support given by the European Union to South Africa in order to finance its energy transition to renewable energies. And there are other JETPs coming. There was one which was signed really recently with Senegal, for instance. And so finally, yes, the African continent is still facing major development challenges, and yet it has to decarbonize and reduce its dependence on fossil fuels and on biomass. And we will end up with talking about energy consumption. And so what do we expect in 2015? We would wait for a progressive decoupling of economic growth and final energy consumption, thanks to energy efficiency gains. We would put the focus on energy efficiency, but there was almost no mention of energy sufficiency. So what's the difference between both concepts? Energy efficiency tried to reduce final energy demand through technological improvements, whereas sufficiency aims at reducing energy demand through behavioral changes. So if we take the example of the transport sector, efficiency would be to increase the efficiency of fuels, for example, and to have vehicles which emit less pollutants for the same number of kilometers traveled, whereas the sufficiency example would be to decrease the size of car or reduce the number of kilometers traveled by person. In 2015, we would expect a stabilization of final energy demand by 2030, which would then be followed by a decrease of final energy demand to stay aligned with the 2-degree scenario. And where are we now? There has been a continuous increase of final energy demand, which rose by 70%, and yet there are important differences across regions here again. As the US, if we look at the top chart, has the most and the highest final energy consumption per capita. So there are still some structural gaps between countries and their energy consumption, and there is also a slow evolution of consumptions compared to what would be needed if we want to stay aligned with the 2-degree scenario trajectories. With regards to energy intensity, between 2015 and 2022, there has been only a 1.3 reduction, whereas we would need a reduction of 2% if we want to stay aligned with the Paris Agreement targets. And yet, quite recently, there were 2 events which brought sufficiency and demand questions to the forefront. Firstly, there was the energy crisis in 2022, which rose the question of energy shortages, and which urged countries to implement new energy policies aiming at reducing energy demand. And so, for instance, the European Union published its Repower EU plan in 2022, which, by amongst other things, aims at reducing energy demand by 14%, if I'm not mistaken, by 2030. And the concept of sufficiency and energy sufficiency started to emerge as well in scientific reports, showing the links between all planetary resources. So in 2022, the IPCC published its assessment report, its sixth assessment report, and it shows the link between the need to reduce demand not only for energy, but also natural resources, water, the use of land, and so on. And so it calls on calling for individual, but also collective structural changes. What challenges and opportunities remain? There is a need to combine sufficiency, efficiency, and renewable levers, which has been highlighted by the IPCC as the SCR framework in policies. And sufficiency actions should be deployed not only at individual level, but at collective level by public powers and local powers, which have a strong role in creating the enabling environment for people then to adapt their behaviors. We cannot ask people to reduce their heating consumption if they do not live in buildings which are nicely isolated. So we need an action from policies, but also companies, citizens across all sectors and in the long term. And finally, we need to monitor actors' capacity to transform the current economic system, which is solely based on volumes growth, into a fairer system which stays below planetary limits.
Thank you. You're ending up with an interesting topic. So we are on time. That's a good news, almost. Unfortunately, Dr. Leipold from Climate Transparency is still queuing in Dubai to enter the COP premises. So we will adapt and try to wrap up with a couple of messages and so on. And we'll try at the same time to answer to the couple of questions that were addressed. Patrick, as you are our reference in many topics, but you've been observing the evolution of this COP negotiation, of the global trends, of the hopes we would have on technology solutions or global agreements. And at the same time, as we see the real trends and the inertia in the changes, how would you, on your personal or analysis, or what would you keep as 2 or 3 key messages from this analysis? Either, by the way, good news, bad news, or questions, but what are the 2 or 3 surprises you would like to share with us?
Well, I think I would take 4 takeaways from the studies that have been presented. First of all, I think that the transition has started in many places of the world, but immediately one has to consider that this transition, this process is not fast enough. It is not rapid enough in order to meet the targets that has been identified in the Paris Agreement, before in the Paris Agreement, and after, with in particular with the IPCC Special Report 1.5. So good news, it has started. Bad news, it is not rapid enough. The main negative point is certainly the fact that the fossil fuel phase out is not fast enough, and it is not identified in the negotiation as with quantitative targets or with milestones in times. And I think that there will be a great progress when there will be this identification of fossil fuel phase out, different for the different regions of the world with different time horizons, but having clear targets on that issue. The positive signs are clearly the fact that there has been progress, clear progress in the development of renewable energy sources. There has been a lot of new technologies that are taking off today. For instance, the electric vehicles. I think this is a positive sign. And I think that with the the whole process of electrification of final energy consumption, we may see in the future new solutions develop almost in each and every sector that consumes energy. And finally, I think that there is a debate that is ongoing on the usefulness of the COPs, the Paris Agreement. Some people consider that, well, it's bullshit. Others say, well, it's a good thing, but there are no results. My personal perspective indeed is the fact that there is a usefulness of this whole process, which might be considered as healthy, maybe with insufficient result. But I think it is of major importance, the fact of keeping the things going on and accelerating the process. And I think that the COPs are good opportunities to induce the fact that more and more decision makers of any kind are taking into account the climate problem and taking steps in the transition.
Thank you. I will make some personal comments if I may. I'm just remembering what Mr. Carney, I think, the governor of the Bank of England, made at the COP28. So that was in 2015, and it was called the speech on the tyranny of horizons. And by the way, he was not typically an ecologist. He was just addressing this message to the banks and to the insurance company world, and just mentioning that the big problem is that all the decisions that were taken, and I will use present verb, that are taken are still depending much more on short-term objectives, election results, economic results of the companies and so on, rather than long-term results. And we have still this dilemma to manage. Look at what typically is happening in England. England has been a very interesting example of strong actions with long-term objectives, with carbon prices and quite strong effects on the reduction of emissions. And now linked with short-term election results and so on, the coming back is quite impressive in a couple of months in terms of decisions. So we have this dilemma to assess in terms of inertia. Tyranny of the horizon remain really a key topic. Well, personally, there are many bad news or figures. The one point among the positive points that we can just take out of this, probably one is that there is much more pressure to that the long-term objectives are decline or into short-term objectives, including, by the way, through legal approaches and so on. This has been emerging since the last COP. We didn't mention it, but all the discussions or court actions that have been implemented in many countries are putting also pressure on corporates, on states, etc., to take actions and to get results. I noted also that there are still many huge potentials in terms of reduction through electrification, which is something that Quentin outlined a lot. But that was not so obvious, and the gains in efficiency and decarbonization of electrification through the retrofit of buildings, which we mentioned, but which is still mostly a potential rather than a reality through transport, etc. And the last point is obviously that what we try to outline with the last slide on energy consumption. Basically, energy consumption decrease has not been taken as a key objective. It's people are looking for growth, for consumption, etc. And now it becomes a real topic of discussion or actions and real objectives. So that's what we put it at the end as becoming potentially a top priority. And I think personally that, well, sometimes we could be afraid of things becoming completely systemic. What we mentioned, the link between energy, CO2 emissions, biodiversity, adaptation, land use, biomass, materials. So it's really impressive the way things become systemic. At the same time, it's also a good sign that if we address the real questions we have in terms of limiting the planet use, the resources use, and so on, we'll solve different issues at the same time. So if we put together also the kind of governance that enables to address these issues of planet resources, it will benefit on all the different topics. So let's take it positively. At least the pressure will come on different ends, but come together. There are some questions we have answered already too. There is which one? We are just looking at the questions and we'll see who can answer. Well, there is a question about national grid in each country. Connect the national grids so that we may address the sufficiency issue. Well, I'm not sure that connecting the grids will enable to offer electricity access to countries, will enable much more efficiency, obviously, not necessarily sufficiency as defined here. We are talking about vocabulary, sufficiency being reducing the uses of consumption. But definitely connecting grids would enable accessing to clean energy, to clean electricity, rather than having and first accessing access to electricity, as we saw the figures typically in Africa. A question about China. Quentin, you want to?
Yeah. So
forecast of the coal phase out in China.
Yeah.
2049, by the way, is a key deadline in China.
Yeah. So I mean, there are two questions actually about how the growth, or I mean, reduced growth in China will change the perspectives in terms of the emission peak and the evolution of emissions in general. And then there's a question about the coal phase out. And I think these two are kind of intertwined in the sense that, I mean, without entering a growth, degrowth debate here, obviously, if the activity is slower than expected, then this will have an impact on energy consumption and then emissions. But I think the key elements, and specifically for China, but for all countries, is how we decouple growth with energy consumption and CO2 emissions. So the key element of the future of Chinese emissions is the coal phase out, more than, I think, the actual GDP growth that we will observe.
There are a couple of questions about distributing the burden and how to manage enable development in regions, and how the developed countries should behave in that respect. So this is a large question, obviously, and how also to split the objectives. When we do our own scenarios, because typically it's a permanent discussion, everybody can have his opinion on who should target what. Should the US that have a huge consumption or emissions rate per person have the same objective? And is it just realistic? When we do our scenarios and distributing the constraints, we would typically split the effort based on two simple criteria: is what is the level of emission in the country, and second, what is the richness of the country. So this enables typically with this logic, we enable automatically a developing country to have a potential of a bigger use of energy and enabling access to energy development, etc., and trying to manage, of course, this through clean energy, while at the same time we put a lot of efforts on decreasing energy, so either sufficiency or efficiency in developed country. So that's in terms of modeling approach. At what the discussions typically that are happening through the COP, etc., which are, as Patrick mentioned, necessary but not sufficient. So it's always the half empty, half full glass, is how to enable this development. Well, in developing countries, it's about money. It's about money. But now, by the way, we didn't mention, we are much more focused on mitigation, so on adaptation. But the discussion now go not only, well, should be, by the way, balanced almost in terms of financial means between mitigation and adaptation. And so developed countries are asking both for money, the $100 billion that were promised that could be reached finally after 7 years now, but there should be the same amount for adaptation now. And that was the last COP27 main result, the organization of loss and damage fund, which will be obviously one of the key topics this year again and for the next years. What, by the way, probably we didn't mention that there are many things that we didn't mention, but what we've observed also is the weight on the focus of IFIs, which stands for International Financial Institutions, if I'm correct. Well, development banks, typically international multilateral development banks. And there has been a strong turnaround in these organizations. They are funding typically development, but the focus on energy transition is huge. They have taken decisions, most of them, to stop any coal investment, to stop to finance any coal investment. And they are moving around gas or out of gas also progressively. So these actors typically are balancing the questions of development and clean energy. So, and there has been a tremendous change in this organization. So that's a positive point. Then there are also sometimes a balance when some big countries financing them stops to finance them, like the World Bank had some issues typically.
I may add at some point on the question of sharing the effort. I think that since the Paris Agreement and after all the steps that has been taken after that, the question of sharing the effort is more on the question of how to finance. I think it is not a matter of targets, because it clearly appears from the 1.5 report that carbon neutrality is the future of every country, with some margins for the milestones to be introduced for this carbon neutrality. But the question, every country should reach carbon neutrality at some time. So this is clear. The question then is how to finance the different costs that are associated to this transition. And this is indeed why the question of finance, either for mitigation and or for adaptation, is a crucial one.
Well, it's time. So there are still a number of questions, but we could discuss hours and hours. So we'll come back to the people who asked other questions that we didn't answer to, except if, I don't know, Héléna, Patrick, Quentin, if you want to take one last.
Maybe I can take quickly the question as on COP27 and COP28.
Yeah.
Highlighting the need to increase renewable energy generation. It's one of the key topics of COP28, and the presidency of COP28 actually put the focus on the development of renewable energies. The IEA has called to triple renewable energy by 2030 and to increase energy efficiency, but yet it's also a way to maybe displace the problem and not look at the issue, which is about to phase out fossil fuels, coal and oil. And we would expect, and we hope that there will be some text and negotiation text on a progressive phase out of fossil fuels at COP28. It's one topic, these mitigation objectives, but they also go with key and emerging, key and urgent questions on adaptation. The global goal on adaptation will be on the agenda of COP28, as well as the question of who will finance the new fund for loss and damage, as we agreed on the structure of this fund, but we did not agree who would be the funders. And civil societies and NGOs are also putting increasing pressure on this topic. So a lot on questions on the fire for this upcoming 28, which will start, which is starting today, actually.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I will not recap, but a last word on what I've learned out of this is we have put and everybody has put a lot of pressure and measurement and communication around renewables development, which is on track or not, we can discuss hours, but it's happening. The thing is that the two other things which are part of the solution are not happening. It's a decrease of fossil fuels and it's the decrease of consumption. So tackling only the growth of renewables, somehow, it's not a sum up, but somehow it's a key point that we outline, that tackling only the renewable growth is not enough. And that at the same time, there must be voluntary actions and strong action to decrease fossil fuels and to decrease energy consumption. So thank you for your attention. I don't know whether we will have a new event after the COP to debrief it or to go into more detail. We'll send out the presentation, obviously. Maybe with Gerd Leipold after the COP, we can have an opportunity to talk about the results and go deeper into this. Thank you. Have a nice day and see you soon.